today. My name is Mahasen Nasser-Eldin, and I'm honored to be presenting to Professor Rabab Abdulhadi, who was scheduled to be with us, but her flight, she was going to come from the US to the UK specifically for this conference, but her flight was canceled last minute, and unfortunately, we have to do our session, her keynote speech online. Professor Rabab Abdulhadi is a scholar and activist committed to collective work and justice-centered scholarship and pedagogy. She has co-founded several community organizations, such as the US branch of the General Union of Palestine Studies, the Union of Palestinian Women's Associations in North America, and the Palestinian Solidarity Committee. And she is the recipient of a number of scholarly and community honors and awards, most recently the G.R.L. Baksharach Service Award from the Middle East Studies Association for her life's commitment to Palestine studies. Her activism includes building Palestinian support for Idle No More, Justice for Michael Brown, the Movement for Black Lives, and Standing Rock. She also co-led 100 Years of Colonialism, 100 Years of Resistance, and the International Palestinian Campaign to commemorate the Balfour Declaration. Professor Rabab's work has appeared in Arabic, English, Farsi, French, German, Italian, and Spanish, in academic journals, and is represented in a range of media publications. And without further ado, I will kindly ask Professor Rabab Abdulhadi to give her keynote titled Radical Feminists of Color, the Master's Tool, Resistance and Repression in Palestine. Thank you very much, Dr. Rabab.
Thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon. I usually begin when I speak anywhere by acknowledging the indigenous people. My university, San Francisco State University, sits on the unceded land of the Ohlone people. And I also traveled between New York and San Francisco. And New York sits on the Lenape, displaced people, people who have been displaced in a similar, not exactly the same, and we always emphasize that we do not conflate contexts, we compare. We engage in comparative analysis and in comparative studies for the sake of actually producing a different kind of justice-centered knowledge for the sake of ourselves and for the sake of our children, for the sake of the future, and for the sake of another world. So that's the first thing. The second point I wanted to make was to discuss situated knowledge. And situated knowledge is something that actually in every single class of mine, I always assign that. In order for us to be aware and conscious, how are we producing knowledge? Where does this knowledge come from? We do not come from the same place, and it speaks to also Audre Lorde's point of difference, that we do not come from the same place. So how do we negotiate our differences? We do not erase the differences. We don't all become the same. We do not reproduce, let's say, the old cliche of womanism as an essentialist concept and so on, but rather acknowledge that we do have differences. We do come from different locations. And when we come from different locations, how do we negotiate those locations in the interest of justice, in the interest of producing justice-centered knowledge, not in the interest of producing any kind of knowledge that might, quote unquote, be disinterested, value-free, neutral, because we know, and if anybody disagrees with me, please feel free to challenge me, that there is no such thing as value-free, neutral knowledge. Every knowledge has a value, is biased in one way or the other. And I'm specifically talking about the knowledge that we commit to producing a justice-centered knowledge because we are being overt and speaking out, and perhaps for the title of the conference, daring to be powerful and speaking up for what we believe in and advocating the whole question of justice-centered knowledge, not any kind of knowledge whatsoever, as we understand that there are people who produce knowledge for the sake of creating nuclear bombs, for creating weapons, for destroying the environment, for accumulating greed. This is not the kind of knowledge that I am talking about. So I'm talking about that particular importance of understanding where do we come from. And in that context also, another feminist concept comes up, and a critical feminist concept comes up, is the whole question is, do we make the points that we raise in our classrooms, in our pedagogy, in our scholarship, do we make some people uncomfortable? And what do we do with this discomfort when it comes up? I am a strong advocate of making people uncomfortable. I am a strong advocate of making myself uncomfortable, because being uncomfortable makes us think, pushes our brains to become much more intellectually engaging, distances ourselves from intellectual laziness, and actually urges us to keep asking for questions and engaging in critical thinking. The other point I wanted to say, and I began to say that before the voice went off, is that I see myself as a Palestinian. I identify myself as a Palestinian, Arab, Muslim woman, she, her, living in exile in the diaspora. But for me, I live in the here and here. So I'm constantly feeling that I am living in Palestine, in my hometown, Nablus, and I have many connections, been writing about that, engaging day in and day out, as I am living daily lives in the United States, or Turtle Island, as indigenous people call it, and we relate to that. And so the whole question, this is the question of what's home and what's homeland, and how do we engage in all of these things. The other points that are very much related to where Audre Lorde is at is to think about Audre Lorde as a living archive. Living archive is a concept that refers to people who are walking around or who have passed on, transcended to the other world, but whose spirits continue to give us and inform us and guide us into where we are going, and is different than the archives in the traditional, conventional way that's only pieces of paper. And we do know that the archives, that such archive is actually produced, generally speaking, by colonialist forces. And they are the ones who have basically produce that, control our lives, make it accessible or inaccessible as it benefits them, or as different forces within that colonizing community decides when it becomes available, when it's not, and so on. And then we become restricted in what kind of knowledge we can actually produce, provided that this is the archives that becomes declassified and so on. And I mean, you are in England, we are in England, so we do know about the British colonial archives, the so-called British Empire. We know about the French archives. We know about the Belgian and various other archives, including, for example, the historical national archives of the colonial world that exists in Spain, in Seville, for example, that ignores the point that in 1492 was a very, very important ushering moment in which, excuse me, in which the Iberian Peninsula fought and defeated the rule of the Andalusia in there, and they call it Moors. And I think it's really also important for us to understand what does that really mean in racial terms, how is that racialized, and so on. And it also engaged into both inquisition and terrorizing of the Jewish and Muslim populations who were living at that time, which is something we can ignore and refer to later on, as well as beginning the so-called discovery, which we know it was not a discovery, which also refers to the terminology we use. And when they say discovery, we do know that there was no such discovery. And we know that somebody named Christopher Columbus basically got lost and ended up in the Western world, in the Western part of the hemisphere. And then that's why it was called even West Indies and so on. But it continues, the myth continues being propagated in that sense. So it's really important for us to both connect the whole question of the historical point, the historical legacies, who we are, and where do we come from. And this is the point in which Audre Lorde in particular speaks about how does she deal with difference? How do I understand how she's dealing with difference and what does it mean? So we recognize that we are different from each other. We do recognize that we do not come from the same place and that we are stratified. Our lives are structured in terms of power, in terms of resources, in terms of ability to control our lives or not to control our lives. If we're talking about a bigger prison, for example, such as Gaza or Palestine, all of it, or smaller prison cells in which prisoners are held in solitary confinement, or they be being subjected to physical and sexual torture day in or day out. In that sense, there is a very big difference between those who are able to even have any control on the air they breathe, the water they drink or not, the meals they have, whether they are able to see the sun or not, whether they're able to enjoy the environment or not. They do not have any control over their very bodies. The only thing that they can control, which is another thing that speaks also to Audre Lorde's politics of resistance, in the sense that what they can control is their brains and their minds, by which they can decide how they can dissociate their bodies, which is a very difficult act to do. And I'm constantly speaking to prisoners, trying to understand how do they deal with that, to dissociate their bodies and from their minds, to be able to remain in control of their own minds. And also, of course, that also brings us to the point of the heart and to the point of the erotic and how the erotic fits in there. But I will talk about that in a minute, expand on that as well. But I want to still stay with the difference and understand how does that difference structure our own lives? And how do we think about the difference in a way, not in a such liberal multiculti kind of way, or the latest terms that are thrown at us, for example, the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is used by multiple corporations in order for them to check a box and say that they've done what they wanted to do. And a lot of this stuff has actually become much more prominent, especially since the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020 in Minneapolis. And then all the corporations started displaying the African, the flags, the colors of the African flag, and making a lot of lip service, but actually structurally not dealing with anything else. And then they came up with this very useful tool, which is part of the master's tools, called DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, by which they assign a department that's supposed to be taking care of that and basically making problems go away so the corporations do not experience any kind of liabilities or have to pay or have to be held accountable and so on. So this is one aspect of dealing, quote unquote, with difference. There are other ways in dealing with difference that have to do with the uncomfortable and difficult conversations that we would have to do, basically in speaking with each other, but also in our own actions, because actions represent talks, represent what we want to do. And specifically, it relates very much to the title of the conference, when I dare mean being powerful. In what ways does it mean to be powerful? And voice is one of the aspects. It's also the actions and so on. How do we deal with that? How do we negotiate our own differences? Do we iron them out? Do we all pretend that everybody is the same? Do we not hold accountable or speak of the past? For example, in my experience and my studies of the U.S. Women's movement, the whole question of the emergence, I would say, in terms of classical discourses of the women's movement, claiming that the Seneca Convention Declaration was the first one, which gives credit to Susan B. Anthony and Susan B. Anthony, and then basically completely erases and ignores somebody like Ida B. Wells,
not only because she was not only speaking about questions of women per se, but she was also fighting for the rights of Black men who were being lynched, which brings us up again to the point of what is the agenda of the women's liberation? What is the agenda of being powerful? How do we negotiate differences? These also came up in our negotiations for the National Women's Studies Association, adoption of the Palestine as a feminist issue, endorsing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions 2015. Ironically speaking, we were actually meeting in Milwaukee, which is the hometown of the late Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, the only female prime minister, who actually said there were no Palestinian children. When there are Palestinian children born, she has nightmares, and has made multiple very racist and very colonial statements, Orientalist and Islamophobic statements, as well as authorizing multiple missions to assassinate Palestinian leaders. But in the National Women's Studies Association, also we had multiple ways of thinking about what do we do around the whole question of Palestine. So one of the things about negotiating differences that we've done, those of us who were carrying the struggle and under the umbrella of Feminists for Justice in for Palestine, and we say in for Palestine, unlike people who say only for Palestine, because we don't only seek the liberation for Palestine from colonialism and occupation, we also seek justice within Palestine for the various communities, for freedoms, for gender liberation, for gender and sexual justice, for workers' rights, and so on and so forth. So we are very particular about that. So when we were conducting these struggles at the National Women's Studies Association, we actually made it very clear that we allied ourselves, and this is one of the ways of differences. We were coming forward with our resolution, and also the contingent faculty, the faculty who don't have contracts, who are hired as lecturers. They can be hired and fired at will. They can lose their insurance. They can lose their stability and livelihood, and so on. So we made it very clear that we are going to go hand in hand, and we reached out to the contingent faculty and we negotiated with them. Ironically, we won the vote, of course. And since then, since 2015, National Women's Studies Association is on record as considering Palestine as a feminist issue, and as well as endorsing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions by the Palestinian movement, that basically says that you cannot cross the academic picket line. It is an academic picket line, just like any other labor picket line, and violate these sanctions in order to hold Israel accountable like any other country on the face of the earth. No more, no less. No exceptionalizing of Israel. No more, no less. And it's very interesting that in one of the statements that were written against us by a Zionist member of NWSA that has criticized us and criticized NWSA for this position, she actually cited Audre Lorde, talking about Audre Lorde negotiating difference. And if you look at the statement, and I was hoping to be able to share it with you, and I will share it afterwards. She actually specifically cites Audre Lorde inaccurately, because she says Audre Lorde only talks about love and coming together and so on, but she ignores everything else about what Audre Lorde is saying in terms of actually recognizing differences, recognizing racism, discrimination, colonialism, homophobia, sexism, all of the issues that structure our lives, and demanding, and very, very clearly demanding, that the master's tools will not destroy the master's house. And in this particular sense, and this is an essay, by the way, that I think we had a conversation with Patricia and Mahasen. I hope it's okay to refer you by your first names. I feel like we're close. We've gotten very close. I've mentioned that I assign it in every single class I teach. The first day, every class I teach, it doesn't matter on what topic it is, every student has to read the master's tools will not destroy the master's house, understand what it means, get into it, and basically analyze it throughout. And then at the end of the semester, I come back and I say, so what did we learn from that? What does this really mean? And so in that sense, the Zionist member of the NWSA was actually misusing Audre Lorde to say that use the master's tools. And one of the master's tools that she was referring to is that we just need to sit and talk. And many of us, and this takes me to the next point around the whole question of voice, many of us know that voicing ourselves or not voicing, voice can be used in a way to express yourself to be very powerful. It also withholding voice and actually refusing to participate and maintaining silence is a way to denormalize repression and refuse to participate in it and recognize repression as a normalized status quo and just go on with it. And so refusing to do that. But here, if you want to also speak about the whole question of voice, how do we deal with it? And in which way can we actually speak? And in what context are we allowed to speak? Because also, when we're speaking about the master's tools not being able to destroy the master's house, we're also talking about the ways in which, whether it was proposed by the various U.S. administrations or it was proposed during, let's say, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement or in any other places, we say, well, why don't you just sit and talk about it? And so we say, okay, we will. And in an organization that Mahasen mentioned, that I co-founded, the Union of Palestinian Women's Associations in North America, we actually agreed to sit down and sit in dialogue sessions with Zionist women in order to talk. But then what it ended up happening is that after about maybe almost a year of meeting every week, talking with each other, many of us were unable to go to Palestine, but nonetheless, some of our Zionist counterparts did not have a problem in displaying, serving in Palestinian ceramics or making hummus, which Israel claims that it is theirs, or they basically wanted to talk, continue to talk. So we said, okay, we will do it. We will continue to talk. We came as an organization, as a collective. They came as individuals. And then after a few months, we said, okay, so why don't we do a project together? How about we buy a mammography machine for testing for breast cancer for Palestinian women in Ramallah Hospital? And we actually were very particular, and this is where really the particularities of why did we do that and how we did it. We specifically chose Ramallah Hospital. We chose it in order to say, I can't see, but it says minutes, but how many? Oh, yeah, good, thank you. Thank you. I see that, yes. We basically were choosing that to say that this is a mammography machine. We are not actually sending anything that might support armed resistance or non-armed resistance or something. Not that we were against. We support the right of people to defend themselves by all means necessary as part of the United Nations and the worldwide recognition that people have to defend themselves, and also as per also the feminist dictum that if a woman is being or a gender non-binary person is being attacked by another person and so on, and they actually pick, let's say, a knife from behind their back to defend themselves and so on, nobody actually says that they are engaging in violence. Everybody will applaud them and say, bravo, you defended yourself, we will support your right, and so on. But so we chose it, and they refused to actually engage with us. So at that point, we stopped the dialogue. And what I'm saying about this point, and the U.S. government also talks about that, let's just sit and talk. And we felt, and I feel very strongly, that this kind of dialogue that does not produce any kind of tangible results, what it does, it ends up basically taking the joy, and this is a very important theme in what Audre Lorde talks about, taking joy out of actually communicating with each other, organizing with each other, coming with each other to produce things, and so on, producing knowledge, engaging in intellectual activities, and takes the joy out of it because it basically takes you out of commission, makes you sit down through multiple sessions again and again and again, talk about something that basically what happens is that our own bodies then become the therapy sessions, the therapy couch on which Palestinian women are providing in order to make the people who might feel that they might be participating in the repression of our people feel okay about it, but without actually producing any results. And that in itself, it's also a problematic way of thinking about it, of how do we do it, how do we... Negotiations in itself, dialogue in itself is not wrong. There is, I mean, we do that day in and day out. We're doing that today. We do it in our own classes. We do it every single day. We engage, and the classroom is not only the formal classroom, the classroom is also outside of the classroom. Knowledge happens everywhere, and class is inside and outside of the formal classroom. As Palestinians say, the prison is a school, and it is a university, and this is something that is not only particular exception to Palestinians. Everywhere we know that people come together, organize with each other, again, because they also, the only thing, the power they have is over their own minds and their own feelings. And so, so that's another question that I think is really important for us to think about. And when we think about a voice and what kind of a voice we're talking about. I spoke a little bit about the whole question of the erotic and love, and the use of Audre Lorde about the erotic and love. And I think this is something that for me, it's very, very important. I always used to, when I'm engaging with the comrades and so on, and people will say we need to be struggling around the clock, day in and day out. I did not have any problem, and I still don't have any problem in doing it. But I always remember and quote Emma Goldman's, "If I can't dance in your revolution, I don't want to have any part in it." But I'll reverse it and say, we are actually struggling. We're engaged in radical acts of resistance. We are working with each other in order to produce a different world, a world where we can enjoy each other's companies. We can live with roofs over our heads. We can eat healthy food. We can breathe healthy air. We do not have to have children going hungry at night. We can have the healthcare we need, and so on. So there is this whole concept, of the love of community, but there is also the whole question of being able to enjoy what we are doing. That in itself, the struggle should not mean punishment and penalties and cruelties. On the contrary, love for the community is what brings us together and what should gel us with each other. But somehow interesting also, and I want to mention something from the Palestinian experience, is that eroticism, the erotic itself, is not always, let's say, a thing, because I don't want to say a commodity, I don't want to use capitalist terms and so on, that is not available to everybody. You are not always able to exercise or engage in erotic activities if you do not have freedom to do so. For example, in the Palestinian movement, both women and queer persons have been historically threatened by Israeli military interrogators and intelligence to use their own eroticism, their own engagement in their sexuality, their enjoyment of their partners, and so on, as a tool to recruit informers and as a tool to pressure them against that. The Palestinian women, including myself, have written about that as a phenomenon called Scott, in which Israeli intelligence has used taking photos of women in compromising positions and threatened them to either become collaborators or expose them. We also know that Al-Qaws, one of the main Palestinian queer organizations, Al-Qaws for Gender and Sexual Diversity, has also spoken about that and explained what has happened. And this has been happening again and again in prison. And it raises a lot of questions about what is it that we really need to do in order for us, I'm not saying we are able to do everything we can, because at the end of the day, we don't control the conditions of the battle. We don't control the air we breathe. We don't control when attacks happen. When do we defend ourselves? We don't. A lot of this stuff is controlled by the powers that be. What we can, what we do as people who are producing knowledge for justice, who are daring to be powerful, who are challenging the inequalities and the injustices in the world and so on, is to think together strategically, figure out how is it that we can actually use certain ways to come together to make it possible, more possible for all our members of our communities to enjoy everything in their lives, including the use of the erotic as a way to be able to live as full human beings and to provide love for the community without fear of retribution or punishment. The next point that I wanted to speak about, and I want to come back to the whole question of alliances and to the question of working with each other. So I want to, by contrast, I mentioned the Zionist woman who has attacked the National Women's Studies Association using wrongly and using the Audre Lorde words out of context. By contrast, I want to signal the communications and the very close relationship on two different examples. There are so many, but my time is limited. So one is the interaction between Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich. Adrienne Rich was a very well-known feminist scholar and feminist activist and writer who have spoken up on so many ways, and people know that one of the main staples in our Introduction to Women's Studies, Introduction to Gender and Sexualities, is the heterosexuality as compulsory question. Adrienne Rich and Audre Lorde had a very strong relationship with each other. We are also proud to say that Adrienne Rich is one of the also many anti-Zionist, Jewish, feminist, queer scholars, activists who has stood up for Palestine, stood up for justice, and has engaged in it. The other aspect that I wanted to also recall, and this is part of also memorializing and thinking about Audre Lorde and other people as living archives, is the connection between Audre Lorde, Cherie Moraga, and Barbara Smith in connecting and creating the Kitchen Table Women of Color Press. And in addition, yes, thank you. In addition to how important this has been, I wanted to mention a couple of, yes, I saw that. Thank you. In addition to that, I wanted to mention a couple of things that are very dear to my heart, is that when we created the Union of Palestinian Women's Associations, actually, we did create it on a kitchen table in Brooklyn, in New York, after we went and we tried in 1983 to participate in multiple international women's studies celebrations. And every single time we will go, we were asked, are you a feminist or are you a nationalist? At that time, now we are able to theorize and figure out, why is this being said? Where did it come from? What kind of situated knowledge did it all bring together? But at that time, it seemed like a very odd. It seemed like somebody was speaking to us a foreign language. And sure enough, we went and we sat on a kitchen table in somebody's home in Brooklyn, New York, and we created the Palestinian Women's Association in New York and in Manhattan, Brooklyn and Manhattan, and ended up in 1986 becoming the Union of Palestinian Women's Associations, the largest organization in the U.S. with 2,000 active real members in 29 chapters. And that's a very big discussion that I'd like to speak about it some other time. But this is also some of the people who were very much supportive of us were Barbara Smith, Cherie Moraga, and Cherie Moraga, if people know, she was the co-editor. She's still alive and she's with us, and may she live for a very long time. The co-editor of this bridge called My Back. And this also speaks to another point that I think is really important when we think about differences and how do we negotiate differences. One is that this bridge called My Back means that that my back and my body and my very being is being used as a bridge over which forces cross in order to reach other things. So I'm one of the people that actually argue against using the notion of bridge, and that saying that we are a bridge and we will want to become a bridge and so on. I don't think I find it very, very problematic to use that. I've written a piece around the second, the 20th anniversary issue that was supposed to be a volume, this bridge called My Back 20 years later, which ended up being this bridge we call home. And I also had a problem with us calling it a bridge home and so on. And so this was one of the issues that have brought us together. I want to mention in the time that is remaining for me three other points. One is that in my own connection with Audre Lorde is that I went to the same school as Audre Lorde did. I'm an alumna of Hunter College, very proud. I was also asked to come and teach at Hunter College as Audre Lorde. I saw the street that was named Audre Lorde Street from my building on the west building of Hunter College, which also Audre Lorde's daughter spoke about when that was inaugurated. I was so honored to be back to that. But the person actually who introduced me to Audre Lorde was not Audre Lorde, was a professor called Myrna Bain, who was a Caribbean professor who was teaching and active. And then when I went back to school, she was the one who taught us Audre Lorde and who taught us all of these, all of her writings, including Zami, which to me also brings up a personal issue. She says Zami is another spelling of my name. And actually, throughout all my organizing days, I changed my name. I stopped using Abdulhadi. If you look anywhere from Women News, from various archives, you'll see Rabab Hadi. And I did choose a different spelling of my name in order for me to dissociate myself from particular family legacies that I came to think that were not really as useful today as they were at that time, but that I wanted to be seen as who I am and my own and so on. The second point is that Audre Lorde, and this is really, really important again, Audre Lorde comes from a generation of feminist scholars who were all actually originate in the Caribbean. And I think it's a very important point, whether we talk about June Jordan, whether we're talking about Audre Lorde, whether we're talking about multiple women organizers. They came from many of them came from the Caribbean. And I think this is really important. And it actually takes more importance when we're thinking about the whole question of transnationalisms and diasporas and not being socialized. And Audre Lorde speaks about that, how we get socialized in a particular context in which Americanness, U.S. nation-state-ness becomes the overarching mechanism of organizing people's relationship to the land and to where they are and to the knowledge that they are participating in. Yes, and so the last 2 points that I wanted to speak about, which were very much important to me, is that in addition to honoring, and I mentioned Jewel Jordan, the people who have passed this year, Ama Eta Aidu, Salma Jayusi, Etel Adnan, Shireen Abu Aqli, and so on. We can speak about all of them. Why? What do they do to us? I wanted to take up the whole question of what does it mean to speak and what does it mean to be powerful? And I think this is something that are we able to always speak? I am one of the people who speaks. I speak my view, my voice, and I've been penalized and punished as the result, as many other people who do. So I want to also remind us of also what Audre Lorde has spoken about the whole question of when I dare to be powerful. And I think each certain part of this, when, under what conditions, I, speaking for the I, the individual as well as the collective, dare, meaning that when I dare to do it, when it is an actually verb that we're daring to engage in, rather than just thinking about doing it, because it's very important to keep reminding ourselves that there is no such thing as we're doing whatever we want to do, whatever we want to do without any consequences whatsoever. We are rational beings. We think about it, which does not negate the emotionality. So I'm not actually proposing a rational emotional dichotomy. You also know what I'm talking about. But when I'm actually thinking to dare to be powerful, and what does this power mean? And understanding what are the causes and the consequences of speaking up, and what are the conditions that are required for those of us who speak up. And if they are able to speak up with less possible cost, but also with having the love, coming back to the love of the community that will have their back and will stand by them and will not allow them to be exposed to what I've called the new McCarthyism in the U.S. context, i.e., the isolation, being seen as a radioactive, being isolated, being gaslighted, being ghosted, and so on, as a result of what you speak about and how you speak about and when you speak about it and how you challenge to speak to power, speak truth to power. And the whole question of thinking about speaking truth to power, which truth are we talking about and which power and for whom? We speak truth to power. Are we speaking truth to power in order for us to appeal to the powerful, to basically give us a piece of the crumbs? Or are we speaking truth to power by exposing power and basically speaking on behalf and in conjunction with the various communities that we engage in as a radical act to sustain our communities in order for us to come together to be able to organize and change the world? In the last, I guess maybe I have 2 more minutes left, right? I want to thank you. Yes, Patricia, we're on the same page. So I wanted to just signal that a project that we've been working on called Teaching Palestine, Pedagogical Praxis and the Indivisibility of Justice. And this project is intellectual, it's pedagogical, it also discusses advocacy and activism, not as something that becomes a luxury that we do outside the classroom, outside we finish whenever we want to, and we keep different parts of our lives separate from each other. But we actually see each other collectively in the way in which Kimberly Crenshaw meant intersectionality, not in the way sometimes intersectionality is used here and there as a catchphrase. Thinking about we are not only that we need to produce knowledge for justice, and if we are organic intellectuals and connected with our communities, we do have a responsibility to be accountable. We have a responsibility to speak up. We have a responsibility to engage. At the same time, this has to be considered part and parcel of our intellectual and academic careers, not something outside of it that can be seen, do whatever you want outside, but actually incorporated in our curriculum, in our engaging with each other, in our engaging with our students, in co-learning with each other, in understanding how do we bring this knowledge to bear and change things. The other aspect of it that is really important, the concept, I think, is the indivisibility of justice. So rather than thinking about differences of everybody having their own cause that they are organizing around, thinking about justice as being indivisible. So understanding that justice for Palestine cannot happen without gender and sexual justice. Gender and sexual justice cannot happen without the right of people to have homes and food and health care and fresh air and safety and not being shot, kids being shot as they go out of the school and so on, and being able to learn and understand. And the last point is that how do we engage that in the curriculum, in what we teach and what we do, because there is a very active project in Palestine, but elsewhere as well, whether it is about teaching Palestine or teaching critical race theory or teaching gender and sexuality or teaching support for LGBTQI plus communities, all of the stuff. There is a very active right-wing, racist, white supremacist, orientalist, Islamophobic, Zionist, colonialist project to erase all of that from history, to erase it completely so the younger generations are not coming out of the classrooms and out of college as those who are motivated in order to change the world, but become docile citizens. And in this sense, if we apply the indivisibility of justice, or when we apply, not if, when we apply the indivisibility of justice and think of justice as something that is indivisible, just going by the words, inspired by the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, an injustice anywhere is threat to justice everywhere. And if we do that, and when we do that, we will be able to have another world. Another world would be possible for all of us as we see ourselves as part of the world, as we dare to be powerful, as we dare to speak, as we would dare to engage and apply our voices in the interest of justice. Thank you.